Hello, welcome back. And if you're new to my channel, it's nice to meet you. My name is Suzanne. I'm a certified astrologer. I specialize in evolutionary astrology, horary astrology, and a modality called human design. So if you're interested in finding out more about my work, you can visit gohigherfrequency.com. I'm an astrology geek, and I prefer the deep dives into astrology, especially during the crazy times that we find ourselves in. I find that analyzing the larger cycles helps me zoom out and use my energy more productively. So today I'm going to share my analysis of the Saturn nodal cycles in case it's helpful to you as well. Saturn and the nodes meet up every 6.5 years. In 2019, Saturn joined the South Node. Now, 6.5 years later, Saturn is meeting up with the North Node. As you'll see, these South Node and North Node cycles are related. You can also see these themes thread from cycle to cycle. For example, the themes related to this current administration seated in 2013, another Saturn North Node conjunction. But zooming out even wider, and of course inclusive of other cycles, it has its roots in the chart of a North Node cycle in 1774, 2 years prior to the Declaration of Independence. I'll be reviewing a few charts to illustrate some high-level observations of these connections in an attempt to help you better understand these cycles. But I'll start with the high-level insights about the evolutionary purpose of this cycle. Saturn on the North Node has to do with issues related to karma, morality, right versus wrong, justice and fairness. It's a time of realignment, of balancing the scales, a karmic debt needing to be purged. In Pisces, Saturn's themes can surface as a conflict between man-made laws and spiritual laws, between man-made truths versus spiritual truths, between materiality and spirituality. The evolutionary purpose of deceptive propaganda, the widespread acceptance of conspiracy theories and misinformation, is to teach us that the truth is not man-made. The experience of fraud and financial loss is to deepen our understanding that the ultimate reference is not in the material world. During these times, we are called to a higher purpose, a need to find a spiritual morality, a spiritual sense of order beyond what can be manipulated by man. On the nodes, it's about understanding the difference between what we can control versus what we can't, where we should intervene versus where we shouldn't. The contrast between growth and materiality versus true happiness and joy. Who and what we should trust versus who and what we shouldn't. It's about learning to adapt to the nature of cyclical change, that destruction is a natural part of creation. It's about letting go of what no longer serves us and answering to our own inner truth, our own inner moral compass. Now, I was drawn to this quote by Martin Luther King, who is featured in this picture here. He said, to put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. What is considered moral has to do with one's value system, and that can be very culturally specific. Something we might blindly follow because we've been conditioned by our society, our family, our peers. And if we haven't looked deeply into why we think things are moral or immoral, and have come up with our own conclusions based on our own inner truth, we might not even know where our morals come from. And this can be compared to somebody who really believes that everybody should be treated with a certain amount of dignity, that they should not be courted off to another country to be jailed simply because they entered our country illegally. And then other people think, well, it doesn't matter what happens to them because they broke a law. And the law is what they're considering moral. And by breaking that law, they deserve whatever punishment happens to them because, that's the law of the land. And they tie their morality to this law of the land. And other people believe in a higher truth. And also, when you think about it from the perspective of the Christian faith, this is the difference between the Old Testament laws and the New Testament laws, which, the Old Testament God is going to smite their enemies because it's God's law. They broke that law and they deserve damnation. And so some people really are attracted to that belief system, which is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And they might be attracted to, public stonings because that's God's law, and God enacts his laws very cruelly to teach people the difference between right and wrong. And so they hold that truth. It's sort of like, the evangelical pastors who became very famous, like Pat Robertson. I did an analysis, a human design analysis of him. And he was always on the TV claiming that certain natural disasters were because of the evil of humanity. And God was enacting this judgment on humanity. And that's very Old Testament like. He's born with the sun in early Aries, where Neptune has just transitioned. So he's a great case study to understand a certain aspect of Neptune in the early degrees of Aries, which can go to these extremes of spiritual warrior, self-righteousness, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It can get really bloody like that when it's in early Aries. The other side of that, the New Testament side of that, speaks to the number one commandment, which is the commandment of loving thy neighbor as thyself. And when you think about that, that's a universal truth, because when the shoe is on the other foot, when we might be approached with a decision where we have no other choice but to break a law to survive, we might think differently about how we're treated. And that's the law of polarity. And the cycles are really based on polarity. I mean, the Earth doesn't really consider morality. When you think about it from the perspective of, this man-made faith versus just the natural forces. Now, whether there's a higher universal truth of right and wrong is up for you to decide. But as far as the cycles, it's really going from one extreme to the other so that we can experience all sides, so we can have the opportunity to come to our own conclusions based on experience. Now, in one life, we're not going to go through all of the extremes of this experience, but if you understand evolutionary astrology, there's this belief about reincarnation and how we go through life after life, learning these things as we're evolving the universal soul. So everybody's going through all of these experiences until we have the experiences of where we're going back into unity. The universe experiencing itself kind of has this full rounded understanding of what it means to be incarnated. And so this is part of the cycle. And this is part of the discovery of this universal truth. And I think it depends on your evolutionary stage, on which place you fall. But there's many gradations to this. Because I remember talking to somebody who lived overseas. I can't remember the country, I think Denmark. And she was talking about how it's so frustrating the ways that they try to rehabilitate people. And these people are beyond rehabilitation. And she was saying, well, she admired the US system, which was around punishment. And so there are gradations to this as far as what is considered punishable by man based on some of the heinous crimes that are committed. For sure, some people believe that those crimes deserve a death penalty, and some people don't. Some people believe, yes, they should be punished, but not by death. That's not our role to play. Just like some people believe that abortion is morally wrong. It's not our role to decide who lives or dies. But there's gradations, because God does give us, if you believe in a God, free will of choice of deciding what's right and what's wrong for our society. And so he gives us access to making those choices out of free will. But there's always consequences. There's always karma that's built up based on our decisions. And that's not always moralistic. It's just the reaction to a certain action over time. You could have the opportunity to have the experience of this polarity. And as I've been going through my midlife crisis, I have watched this in my own self, how we justify certain things when we're going through them, but we're given the opportunity to be shown the opposite side if we are conscious. And then we can learn through that, and we can understand that everybody's going through these kind of polar opposites where they're blinded because they are so stuck in seeing it only from their side and their point of view. Before we dive into the comparison of this cycle with the 1774 cycle, I want to look at the standalone chart as placed in Washington, D.C. Now, if you know anything about Trump's chart, you'll notice that the ascendant is very near his midheaven degree. It's 1 degree orb away. And you see that Uranus and Hygeia are here, which is very demonstrative of what he's been saying. He's giving the financial system some medicine by shocking it. Uranus is the planet of shock and awe, and Hygeia is about health. So we're seeing that play out in what he's been instituting with these tariffs so far. But he's a Gemini, so he goes back and forth, back and forth. And a lot of people who voted for him to come into office voted for him because they wanted change. And so he's very instrumental of that change. But I don't think people realized how chaotic change can be and how chaotic Uranus can be. Uranus is on his north node. And they didn't realize this back and forth, just natural ways that he instinctually operates. And so it's very chaotic, and it is instituting a lot of instability in the financial markets. And people are surprised by that. They're surprised that he's bringing so much chaos into the White House, even though they voted for this energy. They wanted change. When you have this back and forth, it creates a lot of instability, and it creates a ripple effect out into the world, because a leader of the country is supposed to be a little bit more conscious, and they bring stability to a country. And when you are chaotic, people start to panic, and they don't trust you as much as somebody who's making very planned, concerted decisions. That's the nature of him. And when you look at the Sabian symbol of this degree, it says it's an Indian warrior riding fiercely, human scalps hanging from his belt. Now, this really describes what vengeance he has been enacting on his enemies. He has been pushing the limits by making the justice system a part of the executive branch and going after his enemies. He's going after his enemies in many different ways. He's going after colleges by pulling back funding. He's going after lawyers by pulling back security clearances. He's going after his past administration who have come out and said that the voting in 2020 was lawful, and he's taking back their security clearances, and he's asking for criminal probes for those people. So he's definitely going after people's heads and pushing the limits of the law of the United States because he is pretty much unleashed and he's daring people to come after him. Now, whether people do come after him, I think is dependent on our will, our society's will, and how ready we are to have that confrontation. And also, as you can see, Pluto and the moon are on the midheaven, and this describes the emotional upheaval. This degree of Aquarius talks about a Hindu yogi demonstrating his healing powers, and it's about repairing imbalances. And interestingly, the president of China's North Node is on this degree. And you see that there's a T-square forming between Mars on our IC and Pluto and Moon on the midheaven in Washington. And it's squaring the Sun in Taurus in the 12th house. So there's a lot of power struggles and backroom dealing to see who will make Trump the best deal. And Trump's progressed Saturn is sitting on this IC as well. And that can be quite dangerous. Saturn against Pluto. It can incite violence. It's a lot of volatile tension. And Pluto there on the midheaven describes China's president, which is basically, we will not back down. We have the power to withstand your threats. Now, the Saturn North Node conjunction is about reaping what we sow. And Venus rules the ascendant. It has just come off of being retrograde, and it's heading toward that North Node Saturn conjunction. And it's about learning that our actions have consequences. And Trump learned that very quickly after he dropped the bomb of his tariff plan. The markets went crazy. And I think he expected the markets to go crazy. He might have even planned to pull some of those tariffs back and give some of his buddies and himself a leg up on making money. I don't know. But even if he didn't, he might have been surprised at the sell-off of our US Treasury bonds. A lot of people are speculating that people are becoming nervous about us being a stable partner. And so they're selling off our US debt. And that means that it's going to be harder for us to finance our debt. And so our actions have had immediate implications. And now people are thinking twice about partnering with us. So what his plan was is to force everybody to make these deals with him so that we could heal some of our tariff imbalances here. But he didn't realize that the ways that he was doing it would impact him negatively. But some of the things that we're enacting might not be felt for a few years. And if you see this combination of Mercury, Neptune, Saturn, trine, Mars, you see that there's these dark, egoistic ways of manifesting great powers of imagination, but they can have widespread implications. And we're seeing this already as the ripple effect goes out into the global market. And this also describes, because the 11th house is symbolic of the legislator, it describes the budget that they're trying to pass in the House and the Senate, which basically gives them huge amounts of money, increases our debt at the expense of some of our programs that help the neediest. So it really is very dark and egoistic, the plans that they're trying to enact today. But we will reap what we sow. And that's the danger of this time period, where you're going to probably learn some very hard lessons by what Trump is doing today. So let's dive into the comparison of the conjunction that happened in 1774, which is on the inner wheel of this chart, and the conjunction that's happening in 2025, which is on the outer wheel of this chart. Now, I don't know if you know much about US history. I'm going to briefly describe the highlights of what's happening in 1774. It's the time right before the Revolutionary War, when Britain instituted the Intolerable Act, which was based on the Tea Party Rebellion. There was this rebellion against taxes and tariffs that were put on Britain goods that were delivered to the colonies. And the colonies didn't think it was fair, but Britain thought it was fair because it was providing these colonies with protection. And so there was this rebellion that happened, and Britain enacted this Intolerables Act to try to gain control of the colonies. And part of this Intolerable Act was placing loyalists to rule the colonies, to get the colonies to obey. And there was basically a standoff, and people banned British goods, and the tensions kept rising until everyone saw that war was inevitable. Sounds familiar to what's happening today, right? And these tensions were inevitable because of the cycle that was happening. There was a grand trine between Uranus, Pluto, and Saturn, which is described as an organic rebellion, basically, an organic way of leading toward change. Now, we have a very similar configuration that's happening today, but it's different. It's not inevitable that we'll go to war. There's an opportunity for revolutionary change if we act consciously, but it's not inevitable that it'll lead to organic rebellion and going into war quite yet. Now, I wanted to point out that in this chart, you can see that we're having a Uranus return. And people have been talking about the Uranus return as it is in the US Sibley chart, which is when we signed the Declaration of Independence. That's Uranus in Gemini. But in this chart, it's Uranus in Taurus, which is about money. And so we're having this return, and we're also having a reverse nodal return. As you can see, the nodes are reversed. So we're seeing this from a very different perspective, this rebellion. We've become a terrible father, basically, because if you understood what's happening now, we're trying to institute tariffs on other countries to get them into line, to make sure that we stay on top, that there aren't all of these other countries owning our debt, to try to get them to revise what they're doing so that we can remain on top. There's also been demands for a return of money for our protection of other countries. There's also been plenty of actions to try to install loyalists in the executive branch, in the governments, trying to get everybody in line to obey the leadership of this country. So there's a lot of similar themes, but very different as well. So this Mercury, Neptune, Venus, and Saturn alignment describes this rapturous imagination, nostalgic for these revolutionary times, causing wrong ideas that lead to separation. So we're instituting these tariffs. We're isolating ourselves from our current alliances. We're making people back off and realize that they cannot rely on us anymore. And we are shocking the global system. Why? To address our country's hunger for cheap goods. Why do we have the hunger? It's because of imbalances, but doesn't it start with us, our capitalistic imbalances of our own country? That's why everybody's hungry for these cheap goods, because they don't have any money to spend on more expensive items. We don't have a balanced system that rewards people for hard work. There's very much an imbalance between how much we earn in this country versus some of the other people who earn a lot more than others. So we've created this imbalance in our own country, and the other countries have responded to that imbalance by providing us with what we need, because there is an imbalance globally too. Not everybody has the resources that other countries have. So there is definitely an imbalance here. So the ascendant in this 1774 chart is ruled by the sun, and you can see the sun on the south node with Mars here. So it's very symbolic of the taxes that were put on British goods for repayment, for protection, and now we are demanding that of other countries. The north node in this chart, it's also an aspect to Neptune in the second house. Saturn, Neptune often features in a collective rebellion to separate from a system that is no longer working. And in the second house is demonstrating the need to move toward financial independence. You notice that the ascendant is in square relation to the ascendant that we just looked at in 2025. So there is a tension between this rebellion that's happening that formed our country and this need to change something that's happening in our country. And I'm wondering what's going to result in this tension. We shall see. So now let's look at this conjunction as it relates to the Sibley chart, which is on the inner wheel of this chart. This chart describes the time when we signed the Declaration of Independence. A lot of astrologers use this chart to better understand what's happening in the United States. And when I plugged this time period in my human design program, I found that it was on the cross of individualism. And this cross is described this way: a penetrating, provocative individualist who looks out at the world and thinks, what is their problem? I thought this was very descriptive of the United States. And when I was looking at the nodes and the rulers of the nodes, because I wanted to understand the evolutionary journey of this chart, I was really drawn to my friend Lara's description as she gives tips on how to see correctly according to this nodal environment from an HD perspective. Her website is hdfromtheright.info if you want to check her out. She describes it this way: this is the true law of attraction environment. Friction attracts friction. Affection attracts affection. Being able to prioritize and conserve your energy. Accepting natural cycles of loss and gain. Don't talk about what you are going to do, just do it. Serving makes others trust your leading. Cutting back on one area of your life to increase energy and direct more of it towards another. Finding strength by removing things. It also speaks to conservation of natural resources. Willingness to sacrifice. When revenue is going down, focus on innovation. Remain untouched by friction and conflict around you, whether it's directed at you or not. Now, as you can see in this chart, Pluto is approaching the south node after having its Pluto return. So we have a lot of energy on our south node right now. And our south node is about rebelling against tradition. Our south node is co-ruled by Saturn in Libra in the 10th house and Uranus in Gemini on the cusp of the 7th house. And as I mentioned, China's president has his north node right near our south node. So we're really exchanging information and experiences so that we can learn from each other right now. And Uranus in Gemini describes wanting to be part of the future. There's a fear of being left behind. There's a strong need for order and a desire to move away from emotions. Now, we've heard Musk describe this way that we get caught up into our emotions. And if we could just detach ourselves from our emotions, our country would be a lot better. Although he does contribute to that manipulation of our emotions with all of his declarations on X. So we do have a part of our country that has been invested in science and technology and rationality. So that is descriptive of this Uranus in Gemini. But it's also about upgrading the quality of learning for everyone, which we've been straying away from as we are defunding our educational systems, as we're trying to get everybody into alignment to obey. It'll be very interesting when we have our Uranus return to see if we come back to that priority. There's also a description of adding depth with speed with Uranus and Gemini, being attracted to different cultures, seeing things from different angles, constantly learning from what is going on around us. We have strong adaptive qualities here. So some of this is really coming back and learning from our past so that we can go forward. And as you can see, the Saturn North Node conjunction is happening in the third house of the Sibley chart, which is about networks and communication and trade. And it's intercepted in this chart. We have Pisces and Virgo intercepted in the ninth and third houses. So there's this capacity in us to dream big dreams, but it's this conflict between what is idealistic and fantasy. And we see this playing out with this Saturn North Node conjunction as we're having some ideals about where we're headed with our trade partners versus what's pragmatically realistic. And it also highlights the Virgo Pisces axis from the previous chart and how we're having a reverse and nodal return to that time period. Basically confronting what is true from an eternal perspective versus what is false. What are the eternal truths? What is false? What's man-made? And so that we can move forward in a new way. And then Jupiter here is up near Mars in the seventh house. And this is about the material way. It's on the North Node of Trump's chart. And so we're really looking at, okay, well, we really want to go into this new direction. Mars can be very impulsive, can be very indecisive in Gemini, just exactly how we're seeing it play out with Jupiter here. There's a growth of indecisiveness about which partners we're moving forward with, which partners we aren't moving forward with, as far as this new material way that we're trying to move toward. Now, I want to talk about China specifically, even though this cycle is not all about China and the US, but it is a very important aspect of this cycle. They are now the second largest economy and the most serious threat to US dominance. Although it seems we are keen on passing the baton to them more quickly, which was not on my bingo card of possible outcomes. I actually started following Ray Dalio's presentation of these cycles of change before I got into astrology. I was attracted to his theory about how empires rise and fall. And usually it has to do with the imbalances that are created between the elite and the poor. They become outsized. And so you see a fall of an empire. And he predicted that if things didn't change in the US, that China would become the power that it seems like they're becoming despite or in spite of our efforts. Now, I don't know if that's actually going to happen. Maybe these changes that we're instituting will keep them from rising. I'm not sure, actually, but it seems to me that's where we're headed. It definitely didn't seem possible to me that the Republicans would be so mesmerized by someone to allow this to happen. It seems like they were fighting this direction. Seems like they're still fighting it. I'm not sure if they know, but mesmerized they are, and they have created this person that seems to be hurrying this change, but definitely toward this imbalance even more acutely. Aquarius and Pisces energy can be really disorienting. This frequently happens to me, this thing where you think you know what's going to happen, but things get really muddy and cloudy. You don't really know. Like I mentioned in previous videos, Neptune kind of distracts and veils, and where you think you're headed is not exactly the end destination. Even when you review these larger cycles, I don't think you can really predict because of the nature of the veiling and the nature of Uranus. So where we think we're heading may not be where we end up eventually. So I just want to put that out there. Even in my analysis, I kind of take a skeptical view of it because I don't know, anything can happen. We know a little bit more clearly than others. So even understanding history, sometimes you just are thrown a curveball and you don't know exactly where you're headed until you get there. So I take faith in that, especially when people start talking about wars and all sorts of things. There could be a working together eventually. I think maybe that's what the leaders think today. Maybe we can all just join in and work together. I can be a power of my domain, you can be a power of your domain, but we need to get a balance in order so that no one power is lording over the other, although there is some muscling still happening. So I'm not really sure what the end goal is and what that's about. But there is some mixture, some confusion, I think, in how this is all supposed to play out. I think still people want to wield power over each other, even if they don't think it's right for one person to dominate so fully or to be involved as the global policeman, as we've been involving ourselves in. I think there's still this expectation that we're going to be on top, but there's so many wider implications to that. I don't think people are really thinking from a very global perspective, because that's how you have to think, because we are part of larger institutions, just like the states are part of a country, so are countries a part of the globe. And it's becoming more and more important that we think from a global perspective, even if there isn't one specific leader. As you can see, if you become too powerful, you can institute a lot of instability with your partners if they rely on one person too much. So that's one of the things that I would say is the good news about this, is that we all need to become a little bit more independent or spread our reliance out. We can't rely and be dependent on one person too much or one country too much, because like you've seen, they can basically put somebody to power that just totally puts a grenade to the whole world order and upsets the balance. So I think there's lessons to be learned in this dependence on one nation or the other. I think we're teaching other countries that, and other countries are teaching us that. I wanted to look at the charts starting from the conjunction in 1979, because this was the year that China and the US reestablished diplomatic ties. The US signed a bilateral trade agreement with China during this conjunction. Now, as you can see from this chart, or what I'll point out to you, is we've just experienced a Uranus opposition with this chart, a midlife crisis with our relationship with China. And it's also a reverse nodal return in the financial axis. So we are again reviewing past themes, our earned money versus our contracts and debts with others. So very similar to 1776's chart, we're experiencing this looking back and this coming together from a new perspective. There was a quote that It came to my attention from the Treasury Secretary. He said something about purging the excess waste in the government so that we can use that labor for the factories. And some people speculate that they're basically purging the knowledge class and making them work in factories, which is very similar to what the purges that happened during Mao's reign. So we're trying to do that. It's interesting to think about. Are we going to see communism come to the United States? I mean, severe Mao communism. Are we going to exchange sides? Is China going to change its stripes and become more like the US? In this chart, as you can see, we've got Aquarius and Leo intercepted. So the Pluto and the moon is intercepted in our first house, and Leo, Mars intercepted in the 7th house. We're having an identity crisis with ourselves and with our partners. Are we going to see this flip? Are we going to see this cycle from a new perspective? Definitely, we're going to see things from a new perspective. We're already experiencing it from a new perspective, but are we going to flip? It's just very interesting to think about it from that point of view, because that's how evolution happens. It's like we experience things from different angles. So eventually we move beyond those experiences. But we definitely have some control right now to change the trajectory of what's happening. We take conscious effort, like I said, to create something new and something different. So we'll see how that plays out. I also wanted to bring in the 1991 conjunction because it was near the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1989. And it's when the Cold War ended and Tiananmen Square happened. It was during this conjunction that we had a pause in our relationship with China. And the midheaven is very near the previous Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Libra in the 1950s. And we just had a full moon at that degree. The president of China was born during that Libra conjunction. I noted in my full moon video how the Sabian of that full moon chart was a communist activist spreading his revolutionary ideals. And I didn't really understand what that meant because we're so flipped upside down. And then I found that quote from the current Treasury Secretary. Oh, that's what this administration is leading us toward, this communistic structure of the United States, which is very bizarre because people have been talking about communism and socialism and how horrible it is from the right for so long. We've flipped in so many different directions, basically. We're going to bring it home to us, which makes sense when you think about it, because our midheaven, if the Sibley chart, is in Libra. And during that conjunction in Libra, we were fighting against North Korea overtaking South Korea, and it involved China. So we were fighting against that at that time. And now it seems like we're bringing communism home to us because it's going to be Saturn and Neptune opposing that in our 4th house. 4th house is our foundations. So bizarre. I can't even wrap my head around it. But this was put into perspective a little bit as I was starting to go crazy over this idea. Like, what? I can't believe this is happening to the United States. What? We've been so convinced that this is a bad idea for so many years. And here the Republicans who've been so against this idea are putting this forward. Some people from the left have thought that we need more blue collar jobs for a very long time. And now we're going toward it. So it's like, what's going on? I can't make sense of anything anymore. And then I realized that during this 1991 time period, it was when George H.W. Bush was in power, and he was only in power for one term. And then Bill Clinton came into power. And you see how the sun is in Aquarius in this chart while the conjunction is happening in Capricorn. And it's very similar to a chart when Trump was elected. Pluto was still in that last degree of Capricorn. And the sun was in Aquarius. And so it feels like we're going through that same transition that we went through during the George H.W. Bush time period. Now, whether another Republican resets the party or we come up with a new Democratic Party, I don't know. But something's definitely changing for the better or for the worse. I can't tell. I'm hoping for imbalances to reach us in a good way so that we're reordering imbalances in a way that's positive for all of us rather than a few select people in our country. That's what I'm hopeful for. And so what I'm doing is going to focus on my energy in these presentations to bring that to the surface or to suggest that we focus on that instead of focusing on all of this fear that's being generated from the top. And now we have Pluto and the moon here on the descendant of this chart and Saturn and North Node again on the financial axis. So similar themes where we're dissolving some of our current debts and partnerships, and we're looking for new partnerships as we move forward. And we're going through this real transitional change, and it's going to be rocky for some time with the people that we've depended on from the perspective of our government and our government employees and the power that we're confronting. So now let's look at the 2013 conjunction. This is really the seeding period for what's happening today. This is the time period when Xi Jinping becomes president of China. And Trump is campaigning to become president during this time. I found a transcript of him speaking at the Conservative Political Action Conference in March of this year, where he basically lays out his intention to bring manufacturing back to America and to prioritize European immigration. So he's been very consistent about his plans all along. It's just that people are surprised with how he's actually instrumenting these changes without a lot of planning and setting us up for success in this goal. And whether this goal of bringing back manufacturing to the United States is a good goal or not is beside the point, but he's been very clear about his intentions and also very clear that he thinks the way to do this is by enacting tariffs. Now, what I thought was really interesting about this chart was that when I plugged this time period in my human design chart system, I noticed that this chart was on the cross of Eden. It's basically the same cross that both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump was born under, but it's in a different quarter. Now you see the sun is at 24 degrees Virgo, which is in a square aspect to the 20 some degrees of Gemini. And then if you think about the Earth, which is the polar opposite of Virgo and Gemini, it's Pisces and Sagittarius. So you have sometimes the same cross in 4 quarters. So we're headed toward the Pisces North Node. And the first time that he was in power, the South Node was in Virgo. So it's all kind of matching up these cycles. And then between 2013 and 2015, Uranus squares Pluto. And so that's bringing in this revolutionary energy for change. And we saw that starting to happen in the first administration. And then we had COVID, which introduced a forced chaos of change. And now we're experiencing the effects of that basically in a second administration. Now you see in this 2013 chart, the inner wheel, that the North Node, Saturn, and Venus all line up, but are intercepted in the 5th house in Scorpio. So Scorpio and Taurus intercepted speaks to the hoarding of resources or accumulation of things with a reluctance to share, which makes sense to what we're trying to free ourselves from now. This is the one thing that I agree with Trump about, which is about our addiction to accumulating cheap disposable items from China. And even though both of our countries are sharing the benefit of our addiction to this consumption, a lot of the factory workers in China aren't. And that's what Trump seems to want to turn us into. So the worker bees instead of the consumer bees, which I don't agree with. But it reminds me again of the reverse nodes and this quote from the Bible: the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Like I mentioned, we reap what we sow. And we're so screwed up on this because Trump has pretty much flipped everything on its head. And if you zoom out, though, leveling the playing field was exactly what the Democrats were supposedly fighting for. If only leveling the playing field would actually play out to our benefit instead of being a gotcha, like all of his deals seem to be, we might be singing another tune. People have become a lot more nervous because of the risks posed by Beijing's state-led development and more power, especially as it wields U.S. debt. And maybe that's the comparison to the imperialistic rule, except, tariffs is funny. And there have been hackers that have been stealing our trade technology. So there are real threats, I think, to this relationship. And there are real reasons for us to find a rebalancing of the relationship. But the way that it's happening, I think, is what most people object to. And also this moving forward with these imbalances that are actually causing this larger imbalance of somebody overtaking us as a world power is because we've had so much imbalance in our country that forces us in a way to consume these cheaper goods because nobody has money to buy something that is more quality made because we don't earn enough money, most of us. So there are larger reasons for that. The way that we're dealing with it is not to everybody's benefit and not into the agreement of the whole. And then again, we see that we have this repetition of this Libra Aries axis on this 5th and 11th house, which is really about this consumption again of what we need to feel good. The 5th house is about entertainment, the electronics, all the things that we get from China to ease our inability to actually have any meaningful connection in the United States, meaningful purpose, because we have so much inequality. And so we overconsume and we have all of these capitalistic structures that encourage it and encourage these types of behaviors because we've lost our spirit. And so now we're trying to figure out how to rebalance it. But it's basically the full moon off of that Saturn-Neptune conjunction that happened in the 50s. And we go back, we have to move forward. We're trying to go back. How are we going to move forward? So it's basically this dance between the past and the idealizations of the past versus what we should move forward to our future. So capitalism, yeah, that has not worked. We're not actually in a capitalistic society because of these imbalances. The companies have gained more and more control over our minds, over our bodies, over our spending. And so Trump's idea is to shock the system to get us off this addiction, but not quite in the ways that we imagined we should move toward, which is, yes, capitalism isn't working in the current way that it's running because of this imbalance, but do we go toward a China type of arrangement where the powers that be still have that slim access to resources and we're the worker bees? Is that actually going to solve this? Maybe for some, for the small majority, but not for the greater majority, which is where this fight and struggle is coming in. And hopefully we'll win power to the people, but we'll see. So finally, I wanted to look at the Saturn South Node conjunction, which happened in 2019, versus this North Node Saturn conjunction that's happening now, because they're both related to this trade war. As you remember, Trump instigated the first trade war with China during his first term, and in 2019 it intensified, but they came to some resolution at that time, and then COVID hit, and they both blamed each other. And there's a lot of bad blood because Trump was kicked out of office, didn't win re-election. And I think he blames a lot of that on COVID. He has a lot of animosity, extra animosity toward China, because he thinks that China planted the virus in the United States. And China had a similar reaction to Trump regarding this virus. So there's a lot of wounds that are resurfacing during the second trade war. As you can see, with Mercury here next to Neptune in the 7th house, and Mercury's on the same degree as Chiron in this chart. And if you look at the sun of the 2025 chart, it's right in aspect with Uranus and Chiron. We just had a Sun Chiron conjunction in the Libra full moon chart. It's separating now from this conjunction. But when Trump announced his tariffs, Chiron was on the midheaven. So there's wounds that are resurfacing. In 2019, you see that the sun was conjunct Hygeia and Uranus in the 8th house. It's about health, and it's about this spread of COVID and this blaming each other for this manufactured virus is, I think, what Trump was trying to argue. So you see that there's some wounding here, and why China and Trump are not coming to the resolution that they did in 2019. Now, whether they do come to some sort of resolution now, that's to be seen. Right now, they're digging in the heels. And Saturn in the North Node conjunct the Moon and Neptune in the 6th house of this chart. So there's some sobering, there is some defiance, and there is some definite impact to this new tariff war that will be felt by both. I also wanted to point out that in the 2019 chart, the midheaven is in a late degree of Gemini. Both of their suns are in Gemini, and Trump has his North Node in Gemini. Mars was on his North Node during this time period, and now Jupiter is on his North Node, very near his sun. It's also very near Xi Jinping's sun. And so there's this growth of warrior energy toward them both, you know, with this memory. Pluto and the moon are opposite. Mars in the 5th and 11th house. So we see this repetition of the last 2013 axis and how that's playing out. And also there's volatile tension because Saturn is now sextile to the Pluto-Saturn conjunction in the 4th house, and Uranus is coming to trine. It was helpful for me to look at these cycles to better understand them and how they relate together. I hope it was helpful for you. It brings some more levity toward what's going on. I definitely think we are in for a new reconfiguration of partnerships. Hopefully we can come to some resolution that works for both of us. I think it's much better to have some sort of global perspective, not in a sense that one person dominates an imperialistic kind of point of view. I'm not for that, but we all are global. So whether you are bringing everything more insular to your country or not, we still depend on each other. We still have to work with each other. And to muscle power is not the answer, I don't think. To use your power in ways that are collaborative, I think is the better answer. But that's my point of view. I hope we go toward that rather than what we're headed toward right now, which is just a continuation of zero-sum gamemanships that are working for a few people in the world and not working for us all in a more productive way. So that's it for me. Thanks. Bye.